Moira held the blood-spotted cogwheel in the palm of her right hand. She hadn't had a scrape or a paper cut in years, much less experienced the blunder that might result in lacerating one finger on a cog. Laceration is a fabulous word, she thought. She tried not to use words like that out loud. Her ex-husband used to mercilessly tease her about not being able to decide if she was a sling-slinging teenage girl or some old lady who used the most proper jargon and only people's full legal names. But a lot of people switched back and forth, especially nowadays. His thinking it was weird was attributed to the difference in their ages. Andrew Michael Whitcomb was in his mid-40s now, and extremely cranky and snobby. The cogwheel itself wasn't even that sharp. It was brass and about an inch across with 8 little blunt teeth. She hadn't even known she was cut at first, but sure enough, there was a teeny tiny stinging red sliver on the ring finger of her left hand. Weakest of the bunch, poor girl. That is what sometimes happens to curious people, particularly Moira Elizabeth Dunn, formerly Whitcomb. They do things they shouldn't, like pick shiny objects off the floor of their ex-father-in-law's home, mostly out of a helpful impulse, and they miraculously hurt themselves. Serves me right, she supposed. I should be gone by now. I probably outstayed my welcome. She did like it there, though. It was cozy and familiar and smelled like sooty firewood. There were old stains on the cogwheel, too. It was oxidation, rust, maybe, but not really rough or orangey enough to be. It was almost like old blood, like someone just as clueless as she had cut their fingers on it before, however many years ago. Maybe more than one person had done it before her. Wouldn't that be a relief? AIDS can't live that long, can it? Do I know any HIV-positive fixers of, what does this go to, a sewing machine? Cut it out. Not even you would be unlucky enough to contract a disease that way. Snooping around, I see. Gerald Andrew Whitcomb muffled over the last homemade chocolate chip cookie which dangled out of his mouth. He sat in a low wooden chair with tweed padding at the seat, trying to hide the signature grunts of chronic back pain. These are good. Thanks for bringing them. Dust swirled around the chair he'd just sat in. She knew he was allergic and should be more diligent about wiping down surfaces, but she forgave the tiny particles that danced in the light of the late afternoon. No one likes dust. It makes an old house feel older, but people can't even see it on its own unless it's next to some window and in natural light, which there was just barely enough left of today, and then it reveals itself to be beautiful. No problem, she said. She held the wheel up between her forefinger and thumb and turned it round and round, careful not to cut her finger a second time, squinting, trying to imagine it being part of a whole. Does this go to something important? There was nothing mechanical on this side of the room, just a desk with decades-old office supplies and a bookshelf filled with hardbacks and pamphlets like Guide to Multi-Engine Aircraft. Jerry did not bother to look up. He'd just found an old Time and a big stack of magazines and was flipping through pages of editorials from the 70s. I'm sure it does, he muttered, wiping his nose. Put it in the change drawer. She had seen him do that same thing over and over, sit in that chair and read the oldest material he could find, right beneath a black and white picture of himself in full uniform with brassy shapes on his chest. Next to the portrait were pictures of him and Alta at various family gatherings, always smiling, always holding hands, dancing or feeding one another. She was such a beauty. With such beautiful skin, a Canadian orphan, raised in a convent and paired with her dreamy gentleman officer, they were the stuff of movies. But even movie stars get sick. When Alta went, she'd been cremated per her own wishes. Jerry didn't like that one bit. I don't want to burn my baby up. But they did. They had to. It was on the official paperwork. No box checked for Taj Mahal. Moira was there when the lady from the crematorium, the mortician, the funeral director, delivered the urn. She wasn't sure about the lady's title, just that she looked like Elvira. That's when he had his episode. It had been preceded by 7 days of genuine pain but mild wallowing. He was teary and quiet, but tied his own ties and made his own coffee. Here you are, Mr. Whitcomb. The mortician funeral director lady said, I am so sorry for your loss. He thanked the stranger and walked the urn over to the mantel over the fireplace. So far, so good. But once he sat it down, he immediately opened it and made this face, this absolutely focused, emotionless face. Just staring at the ashes like he was waiting for them to move or something. Moira felt kind of shifty, guilty or embarrassed maybe, and thought it was because she was watching someone say goodbye to a pile of ash, and that would make anyone feel weird. It wasn't just that, though. He raised his hand, his veined warrior hand, and scooped a bunch of the ashes out. Moira could see from where she stood there were little bits of bone in the handful, or that's how it looked. Moira said, What are you doing, Jerry? We said we would spread some of them at Fort Stevens, but not today. Then he went and did it. Like questioning had gone too far. He looked right at her and dumped the ashes on the crown of his head and started vigorously, like a violinist, a furioso, rubbing them into his scalp and his cottony white hair, and then the skin of his face, especially in circular motions around his mouth and his eyelids, licking them as he did. And then his neck, his chest, his liver-spotted arms, too. It was comical, almost. It was like Vesuvius exploded in the house and only covered Jerry's upper body. The funeral director, mortician lady, just stood there, unsure of what to do. Moira dropped the paperwork she just signed to the ground. Then he got more ashes out of the urn and started anointing things with them, keeping the urn trustily tucked under his arm, at his side for when he needed to refill his hand. At first it was just that he touched things, clumps to kitsch on the mantel, but then there was the gilded mirror that hung above the couch across from it, sprinkling death onto perfectly good sitting space. Next were both of the oriental china hutches in the dining area, back by the kitchen, and then a beeline for the Tiffany lamp near the bay window up in front. All expensive and fragile things Alta had admired, Moira noticed. He lifted his hand from the urn again and again, leaving dusty rainbows to fade into the air as he patted remains onto all his housewares, and he started yowling, I can't see her beautiful face. I can't even hear her voice. Moira reached out to comfort him, but he swatted her away. He finally went upstairs and must have been blessing more furniture. Moira just started profusely apologizing to the funeral director mortician lady, who assured her it was nothing compared to the people who rolled their parents up in zigzags and smoked them. He eventually returned, long after the funeral director mortician lady had excused herself. He was calmed down enough to sit down on the couch and stare at the wall, but he kept saying things like, "How long will it take?" And he didn't shower that night or the next or the one after that. It took a full 3 days before he could smell himself and decided to bathe. It was a pitiful sight. Moira could only think of how she'd asked herself those same questions, done the same things after her divorce. When will the pain of being left alone be gone? Hers still hadn't. What was the point in showering? After that little outburst, he seemed fine. He'd filled his days with the same hobbies he always had. Collecting and polishing and hoarding, story and joke-telling. The grief might have been out of his system, but that episode was enough to scare Moira into calling Mike multiple times, which she hated to do. "You need to come see your father. He may need psychiatric care." "No, I'm telling you, it was very out of character." She'd practically screamed into the receiver when she got him on the phone. She'd checked the urn after Jerry was done performing those unusual rites. He'd left some ashes in there, but wasn't interested in spreading them at Fort Stevens anymore, even if it was where he'd proposed to his beloved. And he refused to let her clean up his mess. At least he had memory of what he'd done, but that could be a good or bad sign, since he also refused to talk about it when Moira tried to bring it up. "I don't think he needs psychiatric care," Mike had assured his often petulant ex-wife. "That's grief. I have to say it. But it's to be expected when people have been together that long. My being there would just upset him. Just annoy him. Trust me. I'm his son. I know how he reacts. I've known him my whole life." The study they were in now used to be Mike's bedroom. Moira used to try to imagine where a twin bed would go best, how many girls he had up there. Now it was Jerry's favorite place to polish collectibles and to read and reread his favorites. "Classics have proved themselves," she remembered him saying. Fair enough, she thought. And the mismatched bookshelves that lined the 3/4 of the wall space in the room all contained classics of one kind or another, or maybe just old. At any rate, there were a ton of them. And let him have those. At least he wasn't whispering to himself. That was also seriously bizarre. Not quite Ashbath weird, but not super normal. For as long as she had known him, he had had these low-volume conversation, these private talks with himself, between normal conversation with other people. It was like he was mad at himself for fucking something up. He was some sort of PTSD, or Moira was sure of it, because he would say things like, "Get out of my way." He did it so much and so often that Moira started doing it herself when she was alone. Today he was not doing it. Thank goodness, but something was different, eerie in his indifferent normalcy. Moira relented to his instructions regarding the cogwheel. She pulled open the drawer of the desk and dropped it in. The small amount of blood had been smeared off by now. She dropped it in with the $50, the paper clips, the stamps, and a letter opener shaped like a woman's silhouette. She cringed at the sight of that trashy letter opener. He was his son's father, but hopefully they weren't that much alike. She'd take the whispering over weird fetishes any day. Have you heard from Mike at all? Jerry rolled up his magazine and crossed his legs comfortably. He always asks me that, like I need some kind of a reminder that I've been abandoned by him. He should know better. Like Mike avoiding our calls isn't enough. No, he's really busy. I think he and Bridget have been traveling, but when they're not working. That's right. Paris in the fall, Munich in the summer. Must be nice to live out all my dreams with my husband, isn't it, Bridge? Oh, yeah, Bridget, Jerry said. I wonder how long she'll last. Moira smirked but said, I think they're pretty happy. They like a lot of the same things, and her family is from here. A big, rich, well-educated family from what she understood. She's what we used to call a floozy. Jerry switched the cross of his spider-laned legs, topped with pocketed khakis and supported by worn-in boat shoes, proper summer gear, but not ideal for the windy chill of the Pacific Northwest. He still thought he was in Charleston, though he had not lived there since he was a teenager over 70 years ago. You know, you really ought to find yourself a fella. There has to be some guy out there that doesn't mind that your name's too old for you. He winked like he did every time he told that joke. Moira's not a name for someone under 85. You don't need to spend so much time here helping me. God knows Mike's moved on. It's probably his third girlfriend since you guys split. What else am I going to do? No one wants to hire a girl who can barely keep cat hair off her ill-fitting work clothes. I hardly get any freelancing work, much less date. Plus, dating is no fun if you've been ordered to do it, Commander Whitcomb. So what do you want to do with all that stuff? She shook her sudden wave of befuddlement by pointing to a pile of giveaways, duffel bags filled with yarn and knitting needles, bowling balls and shoes and women's clothing, purses, even opera glasses, and fluffy parts of Halloween costumes peeked out. They sat at the base of a broken grandfather clock in the hallway, just outside the door to the study. I don't care, honey. Sell it at a yard sale or give it away to some poor folk. Fine, she breathed. You have to be patient but firm with him, the way Mike never was. She wasn't always patient. A closeness had blossomed between them after Alta's death, and a lot of times Jerry and Moira talked to one another the way, construction workers, peers in disrespect. It depended on how lucid and agreeable he was at the moment. If he was not confused and forgetful about something, especially days of appointments when bills were due, she tried to be Bo Peep to her lost sheep. But if he was with it and giving her shit, she'd serve it right back to him. Jerry was the more skilled, though, and he managed to humiliate her rather severely at times. I'll just donate it. I'll have to see about how to transport that clock, though. I know it won't fit in the back of my little Sentra. He pulled the horn-rimmed glasses out of his breast pocket, his two big button-downs swinging around it. A single shoelace was tied to either end of the glasses. Alta must have done that to the earpieces. She was pretty nifty that way. He put on the shoelace around his neck and fitted the glasses over his nose and must have wanted to return to his magazine. Did you hear me, Jerry? Do you think I could borrow the truck to move the grandfather clock? Moira hollered, theatrically cupping her hands around her mouth. He thought a moment, and then scrunched his face up and yelled, "No, damn it! I thought you just moved her to vacuum." He pulled his stiff torso out of the chair, using only his arms and legs, grunting, and kept going until he was on his feet. He jolted off his glasses with the swipe of an angry editor Moira had known, taking a wide set step closer with a sort of cowboy swagger, ready for a duel if need be, staring right at her, no blinking. It was the longest, slowest battle march she had ever seen, but she couldn't remember ever making such direct eye contact with him. "This is my clock, and she stays right where she is," he said. Moira guessed that she was a little unnerved by his burst of senility, but mostly just annoyed. All of a sudden, he could muster an actual opinion. She'd been telling him for the past 2 years he needed to par down the junk, and he picked the biggest. Eyesore to be attached to. Everything else had to rest in indecision. "Come on, Jerry, you can't afford to keep the broken stuff. That is how this place got so cluttered in the first place." His arms crossed his body like an umpire saying safe. "No," he managed a shaky shout. "I swear on all that is holy. She's only been out of commission a few days, and I was just about to fix her." She really had not paid enough attention to know when it was exactly the clock broke. She'd noticed it before, of course. It was hard not to notice a thing as big of a church in the hallway, but after a while anything can become a blur in the background. "All right, fine," Moira sighed, hands on hips, watching him retreat back to his magazines after the victory. "At least let me get a repairman to fix it. Those exist, right? I don't want you to hurt yourself." Spectacles were removed a second time. "I can fix it myself. Thank you very much." He stopped himself again. "Say, do you want to help me fix it?" He peered up at Moira. "What? I don't know anything about clocks. I don't even have a toolkit. Your lovely son took all that stuff with him." "That doesn't matter." The bridge of his glasses were slid over an oily nose again. With the frames properly on, Jerry looked just like an owl. "I have tools. I can teach you." "All right then, I'll be Swiss for the day." She sort of laughed, and Jerry did not react to the joke, if you could call it a joke. Her smile faded. "It's not a cuckoo clock, stupid." "All right. Sorry." They had leftover clam chowder that Moira made too much of the night before, adding a few crusts of sourdough bread. Jerry cracked open a bottle of white because they were having seafood, and it was technically correct. She had watched him slowly pour the bubbling liquid into the glasses where they sat, into fine glassware at the TV tray in the living room, next to styrofoam bowls of soup. Wheel of Fortune was playing on in the background. It was a family favorite. Pat Sajak was grinning ear to ear, and Vanna White was tapping a giant computer screen with letters on it. Reheating and eating dinner always took longer than it should here, especially while sitting on the couch with the TV on. And it was still light outside, but not for much longer. Wouldn't be long enough to repair a clock, for instance, before Jerry's bedtime. "Thanks for dinner, Jerry. Can I be excused, Dad? I barely survived learning to pump gas. I'm not sure I can get to fixing a clock today." He only nodded in response, but said nothing. Was he finally admitting that he was lonely and needed help? That must be why he wanted help fixing the clock. You know, you can just relax tonight. It's too late to start a project. I can come by later in the week if you want. He drained his own wine glass and refilled it right away. His brow was wrinkled up into a permanent crest between his eyes, with lesser rippling waves out across his forehead, but chugging the wine seemed to smooth them a bit. No, I think I'm going to make it a late night. He sat in his leather recliner on the couch and scooped up the chowder with his plastic spoon and shoveled more of it into his mouth. That is some good chowder. He smacked his lips. Moira's mouth dropped open. He didn't sound anything like himself. And that sound, Jerry had never been a shy person, per se, but for some reason that single emphatic humming sound, that put her on edge. It was not a noise he had ever made before, at least not in front of her. Luck of the Irish setter. He gulped and clapped like a snacking child at story time, dribbling the soup on his khakis and almost dropping the spoon. And he's actually guessing the Wheel of Fortune puzzle, and he's laughing, not at a snide joke, but a big laugh of enjoyment. Are you feeling all right, Jerry? The corners of his mouth turned up even further into a clownish grin. I have never felt better in my whole life. He said. This is weird. This is another episode just waiting to happen. I can already tell. She stood, grabbed the half-empty bottle of wine from off of his tray and huffed all the way to the kitchen, dumping it out in the sink as soon as she got there. She wasn't angry necessarily, but suspicious. And this type of silliness could get out of hand, and very quickly. There were stairs in this home, and a gas stove with multiple burners, and lots of unaccounted for sharp things. Don't be such a party pooper, she could hear him say from the couch, a little more like himself now. She returned to the living room only to clear her dishes, paced back into the kitchen, and then streamed in again to get her purse and coat from the stand next to the front entrance, knowing that if she didn't leave before it got dark and before she had a glass of wine, she might be tempted to stay there and keep an eye on him, and she couldn't have that. She wanted to be the helpful ex-wife, one that admirably outdid Mike with his familial duties, not a perceptibly burdensome one. I'll come back later this week. Stay out of trouble, please. Call me if you need anything. She looked back at him, her hand on the doorknob, ready to leave. Jerry was being himself, watching the TV and eating soup in his favorite chair like he did each and every night. Maybe she'd been too quick to dump out his wine. Was she too presumptuous? She's not even his daughter. He's Mike's dad. Plus, he had more than earned a little bit of silliness now and again. She realized her own wine glass was still sitting on the TV tray in front of her seat. She reached and put it onto his. Here you go, buddy. Jerry was too busy eating the chowder and watching Vanna fill in vowels to observe the gesture, but he saw the glass out of the corner of his eye. Oh, don't worry, I planned on getting to that. Oh, Moira said, feeling stupid. He grabbed her forearm. You are a good girl, Moira Whitcomb. He fixed his eyes on hers the way he had in the study, brimming with intensity almost, but not as quite as much as earlier. Does he need meds? He remembers I'm divorced from Mike, doesn't he? Thank you, Jerry. Take care, all right? Don't stay up too late. You do need some rest." He gave a single nod and went back to dipping toast in his soup. He was bored of that kind of lecturing. Even in his silly state, he had more than outgrown being told what to do. She closed the door behind her. Greg Ramos, the cop who lived next door and who terrified Moira, was waxing a convertible. She waved and smiled, a fake smile, and hurried down the driveway to the Sentra parked on the street. She breathed a bittersweet sigh of relief as she reached the sidewalk at the end of the driveway, pitying folks who had never journeyed to this city. Sunset in Astoria was red-orange that particular evening, with the perfect proportion of clouds to accent the sinking sun, like a postcard, especially where Jerry's house was. Boats lined the docks, and a few steps away, Victorian houses the streets. This is where 19th century adventurers came to ogle theatrical seaside vistas, and the ones made famous by Washington Irving through his friendship with the big man himself, John Jacob Astor. Most were immigrants and East Coasters who hoped to make their fortune in the fur trade, the equivalent of the California gold rush. Many were successful, and their homes still stood there. The newest building around this stretch was maybe 120 years old, and foghorns and gulls were louder than anything else. What she loved best was the smell. It was the smell of the ocean's saltiness that died off gradually into brackishness the further you got from the shore, but it never completely died. It lingered in the pines. She lived up the river in a one-bedroom townhouse, the same one she and Mike had cohabitated those 4 years ago, when they were, Mike was still a mid-range accountant, and she could pronounce his title, and before he was making bi-coastal deals and living among deluded flower children with Bridget. Technically, Mike still owned the townhouse. She didn't take him to court for it or anything. The lawyers were big enough bullies on and off social media to prevent that sort of thing. So she paid him fair rent. It was fair, right? He and Bridget had just bought a house in Portland, where they both worked now, near to where Moira grew up, actually. It was a big house, but again, not very far from those hordes of deluded flower children with fluorescent hair and ideas that weren't new, just repeated. So they weren't that grown up, especially Bridget. Moira couldn't be sure, but she guessed the girl was maybe about 2 years younger than her, which made her about 14 years younger than Mike. Fairness could have dictated Moira's own ability to exchange him for a new bottle. Maybe not a husband, still too soon for that, but maybe a boyfriend of sorts, or hell, a hobby would do. But fairness is not an essential part of nature. Fairness is a myth implemented by kindergarten teachers and the occasional politician, she thought. And so a general, global, perhaps universal lack of fairness consumed any and all motivation Moira had to compete with people who were able to fall in love and out of love and back in again. Besides, she liked her life, didn't she? It was adequate and lacked the complications associated with romantic living. Fewer ups meant the downs were less eventful. Contentedness will have to do. There were lovers before Mike. She often wondered if those few late-teen romps had paved the way for her disappointing husband. It was possible they did, but there were other things in her past, more pressing matters within her that made Michael Andrew Whitcomb a possibility. He promised her something. He was supposed to be a haven. She didn't always need a haven. There was a time long, long ago when coloring books and pill bugs and pawns would have sufficed. But very bad things had happened to Moira. These things made it nearly impossible to feel sane without a heavy anchor.